hopefully offer you some perspective about the history of women's rights in this country, what ordinary people who were sort of upset and tired and exhausted from being sort of viewed as second-class citizens did in the face of great challenges, and hopefully inspire some of you to be some of those ordinary people for us now. With us today, we are SARU, by the way, which is probably important for you to understand, the Center for Ethnic, Racial, and Religious Understanding. We're here at Queens College. I'm Asia Gray, the Fellowship Director. And with us today, we have two fantastic, wonderful people who are involved in their own feminist and sort of reproductive justice work. Amy Herzog, who's a professor here at Media Studies, and Lynn Roberts, who is also a professor who works primarily in reproductive justice. And so we're honored to have them with us today. And then we also have a presentation from Planned Parenthood to talk about some of the work that they're doing and how you can get involved with that if that is an interest of yours, which I hope it is. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Amy Herzog.
I'm going to try to keep my comments really brief, just because there's some hands-on presentations later. And I think QC Girls is here too to talk about activism on campus, which is really fantastic that exists. So I just wanted to talk a little bit beforehand. Asia had mentioned that there may even be, in some surveys around campus, a sense that issues related to women's rights are either something that it's kind of rooted in the past or aren't important elsewhere or in other times, which concerned me. And I'm guessing this is probably sort of a self-selecting group, and I know the students from my Gender and Media Studies class who are here recognize the urgency. But I thought I'd start off with just some quick statistics to kind of emphasize the urgency of a lot of the issues that we're dealing with. And also to mention, I don't know if people know, today is a day without women. There had been a call for a general strike of women. Some of these general strikes have been hard to mobilize, but the idea, I think, in their platform is to make a link between not just the issue, say, of access to reproductive care or sexual violence, issues obviously of urgent importance, but to look at other structural issues such as economics, and argue that economic injustice is violence too, that these kinds of structural barriers intersect with so many other issues in terms of creating really, really real problems for all kinds of women today. So just a few statistics to throw out at you. 1 in 7 women in the US live in poverty, and then if you begin to break this down by race, a quarter of African American, Latina, and Native women live below the poverty line. There is a gender wage gap that has been persistent and hasn't budged very much over the course of the past few decades. For every dollar paid to US men, on average, women make 80 cents. And again, if we start breaking this down in terms of racial and ethnic groups, African American women make 63 cents to the dollar, Latina women 54, Native women 58 cents, and this is also a disparity that impacts foreign-born women very badly. And if we start further breaking things down by professions, the wage gap is persistent and huge. Homelessness is a major problem for women and families, and I'd like to not sort of put up a false border too between women and the queer community, women and the trans community. If we look at issues of economics and think about this less about sort of looking at biological women, but looking at gender and sex oppression in general, 40% of homeless youth are queer. And they only make up 10% of the population. So there's obviously major structural and oppressive issues here to deal with. For anyone thinking about retiring, US women are 80% more likely than men to be impoverished at age 65 or older, and women 75 to 79 years of age are 3 times more likely than men to fall below the poverty line. So these are really stark statistics. I mean, a lot of the issues that need to be addressed here have their roots in global capitalism, also in terms of representation. If we look at candidates like Sarah Palin or leaders like Margaret Thatcher, it's not as if we just can put women in office and solve problems, but nevertheless, issues of representation, if there are fewer women in positions of power and leadership, we have a statistically lower chance of issues that impact women being legislated. And this was just a statistic that was released in the Times this morning from a study that looked at the percentage of women who hold seats in parliamentary or other kind of legislative bodies in countries. Rwanda is actually the highest because they have a law that 30% of representatives have to be women. The United States is 104th on the list. So we're not doing well in that area. In terms of sexual violence, domestic violence, this is obviously a pervasive problem in the United States. 1 in 5 women will be raped at some point in their lives. And under our current regime, there's clearly been a shift in rhetoric, and I know the other speakers later today are going to be speaking about the legislative attacks that are going to be, that are already in play in terms of issues of sexual violence, in terms of economic equality, issues that are going to affect people on campus in terms of trying to erode Title IX defenses, to erode the ways in which sexual violence crimes and assaults on campus are reported. So this is something that could not be more urgent right now. This is not a problem of the past. I wanted to talk a little bit. I had tried to come up with sort of a history of the women's movement, and I decided I couldn't because it's too broad, it's too diverse, and that history is too contentious. So I thought instead maybe I'd say something about how the women's movement is really in many ways defined by these kinds of conflicts, that it's always been a multiplicity of movements, and how the kind of struggles and failures that have happened within the various groups associated with the women's movement might sort of shed light on our present condition, that this history might offer us some lessons about how to move forward. So if we go all the way back to 1848 with the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, where a group of women came together to organize around issues of suffrage, to fight for the right to vote. Already at these very early meetings, there were strong rifts between different groups of women, some of whom were associated with the abolitionist movement, others who were associated with the eugenics movement and the temperance movement, and the struggle to sort of figure out how to mobilize, how to achieve these goals strategically, and whether or not this should be approached as sort of an issue of shared liberation. For example, joining with freed slaves who were fighting for the right to vote for people of color, or whether they would organize independently because they were afraid of sort of losing more ground if they worked in a collaborative way. This did not always move forward in an easy way. So we have from very early on Black women's rights advocates like Sojourner Truth, who gave a speech in 1851 at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in Akron. This speech was then modified and republished later, rewritten by other feminists, and so we know it now in that rewritten form as the Ain't I a Woman speech. But speaking up about how the platform being pushed forward by mostly upper middle class white feminists was not speaking to the experiences and the needs of African American women and of other communities of color. How many people have heard of Matilda Jocelyn Gage? She was a contemporary of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Susan B. Anthony was involved in writing a lot of the early documents associated with the women's rights movement. She was also, her house was on the Underground Railroad, or stuck on the Underground Railroad. She was a fierce abolitionist and also became deeply involved with the Native American rights movement in Western New York, was actually adopted by the tribe, and became an advocate for the third sex, sort of the third sex movement, and much more fluid ideas about gender that were being advocated for sort of in Native culture. And she's basically been written out of the history of the early feminist movement. She split ranks with Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. So I just wanted to sort of mention that this, this early history was filled with debate, and a lot of the figures who kind of broke ranks with the mainstream movement weren't able to kind of maintain their prominence. Another huge conflict that came out of this early movement involves the eugenics movement, and I know that this is going to come up in Lynn's talk later, but I wanted to mention how reproductive rights from its early the early advocacy of Margaret Sanger and others was linked very closely to the idea of eugenics. That outreach to immigrant groups was usually done under the guise of hygiene, cleanliness, controlling troublesome populations, and oftentimes very thinly veiled attempts to purify and improve the race. Which is not at all to, I stand with Planned Parenthood, there's been a kind of pushback by the right, in fact, to frame Sanger and